In part 1 of Capcom and the Sega Saturn, we went over roughly half the games they released for the system. Classics like Street Fighter Zero-2, Resident Evil, and Cyberbots. Believe it or not, Capcom just kept hitting home runs on the Saturn, and in this episode we will be looking at the final 16 releases from them. Most of the games we looked at in the first episode did not have the benefit of the extended RAM cartridge, but because the games you are about to see were released later, many of them could use the 1MB and eventually the 4MB RAM cartridges, vastly improving the quality of the Saturn arcade ports. Some were so close they were virtually identical. Let's waste no more time and get right to it, Capcom and the Sega Saturn, Part 2. August of 1997 would bring us Marvel Superheroes, what was essentially the first sequel to X-Men Children of the Atom. Some of the characters make their return from that game, as well as a few newcomers from Marvel's other properties. We get popular characters like Spider-Man, the Incredible Hulk, Iron Man, and Doctor Doom. Capcom made sure this port used the extended RAM cartridge to make it even closer to the arcade, but it's not required to play it. My overall opinion of this port is favorable, but there is some slowdown here that manifests regularly during gameplay. You can feel it especially if you play it directly after the arcade original. I swear it even feels a bit worse when you use the RAM cartridge. I'm not sure if accessing the additional frames during the match causes it, but it's definitely there. Nothing here is ruined, however, and this is still a damn fine playing game. Everything is bigger, has loads more animation, and there is just a feeling of so much going on all around you. You even get to kick Thanos' ass at the end of the game, a fight that is far more fair than Magneto at the end of Children of the Atom. This is the only Capcom title released outside of Japan that uses the extended RAM cartridge. Right on the heels of Marvel Superheroes, Capcom released one of the best values in gaming at that point, Street Fighter Collection, in September of 1997. This compilation came on 2 discs. The first had Super Street Fighter II and Super Street Fighter II X on it. X is what Super Street Fighter II Turbo was called in Japan. The second disc came with an enhanced version of Street Fighter Zero-2, called Street Fighter Zero-2 Dash, which was called Street Fighter Alpha 2 Gold in other territories. This pack of games was so incredibly cool to own in one go. You got the classic action of the Street Fighter II games, combined with all the great things the Alpha series brought to the table in one package. While I enjoyed playing the Super Street Fighter II games again here, the real star of this show is without question Street Fighter Zero-2 Dash. There are old and new unlockable characters available by simply tapping the start button, Cammy is now available, custom combos have been tweaked, and some characters have new moves and story changes. The biggest new addition is the Akuma or Goki mode. This allows you to face Shin Akuma anytime you want right from the opening menu. He is an absolute monster, capable of cutting animation frames to counter you on a nearly psychic level. I can beat him, but it is never an easy fight. Unfortunately, none of the games in the Street Fighter collection use the extended RAM cartridge, and I would have loved to have seen Zero-2 Dash with it. That's okay though, because this package is still a heck of a value without it. Capcom did release Street Fighter Zero-2 Dash in Japan as a standalone product under the Satakore line. Everything changed in November of 1997, because that was when Capcom released X-Men vs. Street Fighter with the brand new 4MB extended RAM cartridge. What had been almost a novelty up until this point, this new enhanced card allowed previously unobtainable things on the Saturn platform. Gone was the meager RAM limitations of the CD-ROM platform, replaced now with nothing but possibilities. And man, did X-Men vs. Street Fighter demonstrate those possibilities. The flashy combat mechanics of Capcom's other Marvel fighting games gets thrown into high gear here, now faster and more explosive than ever. Everything you see on screen, whether character or background, is dripping with color and animation. There is so much going on too, whether it's characters tagging in and out, or a team super move filling the entire play area with fireworks, there is always something going on to impress you. The tag team based gameplay was great too, allowing you to mix and match characters of differing styles to allow more flexibility in your attacks. The final battle with Apocalypse was even quite a bit different than what we had seen in any other fighting game. No doubt about it, if you owned a Saturn in 1997 and had access to this, you were as happy as I was. No other console at the time had anything close. Unbelievably, Capcom and Sega never reached an agreement to release this outside of Japan.
Optic blast. Gene splice. Marvelous. Optic blast. Good.
And the hits just kept coming. In April of 1998, Capcom unleashed Vampire Savior on us, a port of the arcade game known as Darkstalkers 3 in the West. It also utilized the 4MB extended RAM cartridge, and the results are quite possibly the finest 2D animation we'd see on the Saturn. I mean, take a moment and soak in what you are witnessing here. The backgrounds, and I mean every single one of them, is just loaded with moving pieces and great art direction. They are alive with both the familiar and alien, straddling the lines of reality perfectly. Each character here is based on a real-world beast or myth, and is personified perfectly by the on-screen sprite. I'll make no attempt to hide my love for this one, and just say I feel this is the best-looking 2D fighter on the platform. That's not an easy claim to make, and there are certainly arguments to have about other games, but the quality here is definitely top tier. Its direct competition at the time was a PlayStation version that was butchered in comparison, so it still holds up in my mind as one of the best representations of the game. Couple it with a Saturn controller, a good CRT, and a nice set of speakers, and it was a fighting experience that no other console during the 5th generation could come close to. The Saturn game never left Japan. I went over a few of Capcom's full-motion video games in part 1, and they didn't stop there. Super Adventure Rockman was released in June of 1998, another adventure game that relied on video segments to tell its story. It came on 3 discs, with each being a dedicated episode in the story. It plays a little different than you'd expect, having both on-screen prompts and real-time battle segments needing to be completed before you move on to the next video segment. I always found Capcom's obsession with making full-motion video games so long after the genre had failed so peculiar. I mean, they very clearly never intended these games to leave Japan, because even the PlayStation release of this stayed locked there. It also happens to be incredibly tedious, and trying to slog through its more difficult battles is a pure exercise of your patience. For those of you curious enough to hunt down a physical copy, be sure to get the reissue that is numbered T1241G. The initial release of this game was recalled due to a disc imperfection that wouldn't let you finish the game. Remember the cute chibi art style Capcom used in Puzzle Fighter 2 Turbo? Well, they decided to build a full-fledged fighting game around it and released it in July of 1998. It was a nice mix of characters from various Capcom franchises, and uses a much simpler attack interface compared to previous fighting games from the company. Here you get 4 buttons: punch, kick, special, and taunt. Special is your unblockable attack that drains gems from your opponents. These gems power your various special attacks that are represented by the gauges at the bottom of the screen. Yep, you guessed it, this is a game heavy on flashy attacks and special combos. The custom combo system is centered on the extremely easy rapid fire attacks with the punch and kick buttons. Don't look past Pocket Fighter because it's simple to play, however, because there is a lot of playability here. It supports the 4MB extended RAM cartridge, so the sheer amount of variety in the attacks is insane, and you'll want to try out all the characters to see who or what they will become during their gameplay. You'll have a tendency to feel out of control when you first play because there is so much going on, but a few plays will acclimate you quickly and you'll likely come around to recognize the potential of the gameplay, particularly its 2-player mode. It's a sleeper and one I recommend for those looking for a Capcom fighter on the Saturn that looks and feels a bit different from the status quo. The Saturn version here is Japanese exclusive, but it was released outside of Japan for other systems as Super Gem Fighter Mini Mix. August of 1998 would bring us Capcom's first release in the Capcom Generation line. This compilation would include the classic shoot-'em-ups 1942, 1943, and 1943 Kai. As far as the quality of the individual ports, they're fairly solid overall. They look and play like they should, which should come as no surprise given their age. I mean, these games are not going to push hardware like the Saturn anywhere close to its breaking point, no matter what it puts up on the screen. The big difference that would be a factor in many of the Capcom Generation releases is that the Saturn cannot do the original low-resolution mode many of these ports ran in. This means that you get slightly different aspect ratios in the Saturn versions, and sometimes even black borders in various places. This is going to bother some people on a level that makes these ports unacceptable, while others won't care a lick. There is Tate support for those that care. If you are a fan of this series and aren't fussed with the resolution difference, it's a fair compilation. If you want something more faithful, the PlayStation release supports the original low resolution for you. Capcom quickly followed up with Part 2 of Capcom Generation, released in September of 1998. This time we get Ghost and Goblins, Ghouls and Ghost, and Super Ghouls and Ghost. I love this group of games as a fan of the series, and the Saturn version of this compilation is very nice. The sound, color, and animation are all faithful to their arcade roots, and the gameplay is solid with mild bouts of slowdown here and there. The worst of the slowdown comes in Super Ghouls and Ghost, a likely holdover from its Super Nintendo roots, but it's nowhere near as vicious and as prominent as it was in that version. These are 3 of the hardest games Capcom ever produced in my opinion, particularly when you include the second replay that is needed to see the real ending. If that challenge is for you, the Saturn games here are great time sinks and the timeless presentation is still rock solid. We received the third and weakest link in the Generation line during October of 1998. This compilation includes XX's, Pirate Ship Hajimaru, Sun, and Vulgus, 4 of Capcom's earliest arcade games. In fact, Sun was their very first arcade game ever in Japan. I wish I had some good things to say about this disc, but these games are simply too old and there are too few of them to hold your interest for very long. XX's is a vertically scrolling shoot 'em up from an era where these types of games were extremely simple, and you'll get tired of it quickly, particularly due to its repeated graphics across the entire game. Pirate Ship Hajimaru is similar to Sega's Pingo, but instead uses a pirate theme. Move the blocks around to dispatch your enemies. It's fun for a few minutes. Sun is sort of an early run and gun that has you shooting enemies between multiple layers. It holds up better than the other games in this compilation, but it still is about as simple as games come. The last game is Vulgus, another vertically scrolling shoot 'em up. It looks and plays a bit closer to the stuff that would come a few years later, but again it's so simple in terms of power-ups and enemy patterns, and that is pretty much the ever-repeating theme of this particular compilation. These games aren't bad at all, but have aged to the point where the experience is just too antiquated to play for long periods. This was particularly true at its release, where Capcom charged $60 for it. Another October 1998 release was Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter, which happens to be one of my personal favorites on the Saturn. This follow-up to the popular X-Men vs. Street Fighter changes around the roster a bit and adds the variable assist feature, which allows you to utilize a second team member's power without actually tagging out. Otherwise, this is more of a mild update versus an entirely new game, with much of the scenery being the same with Capcom's previous Versus effort. I enjoyed some of the roster changes here particularly, especially the addition of Captain America and Sakura, and I always enjoyed the hidden characters. Visually, it's as stunning as X-Men vs. Street Fighter, and once again employs the 4MB extended RAM cartridge to bring you as much of the arcade's great animation as possible. The gameplay still centers around tag team action, of course, and much of the same music is reused from Capcom's other efforts. On the plus side, you do get a new end boss to contend with here, one far more traditional than the one you faced before. If you own X-Men vs. Street Fighter, there is an argument that you could skip this one entirely because of their similarities, but I think the new characters, end boss, and variable assists add enough to warrant owning even so. It's another one that completely destroys the PlayStation version, and wouldn't be surpassed until Marvel vs. Capcom on the Dreamcast the following year. The Capcom Generation series got back on track with the fourth entry in November of 1998. This compilation includes the top-down run-and-gun shoot-em-ups Commando, Mercs, and Gunsmoke. They are based on the arcade versions, and while having aged quite a bit even at the time of this release, I found them quite a bit more palatable than the games contained in the third Capcom Generation release. First up is Commando, the simplest of the three offerings here. Nothing will blow you away visually or in gameplay, but it can hold your attention a bit thanks to being fast and challenging. Fortunately, Capcom chose its sequel for the second game, Mercs, which retains the arcade original's 3-player simultaneous co-op feature thanks to supporting the Saturn's 6-player adapter. This is visually a huge leap over the first. The gameplay has tons more variety thanks to more weapons and power-ups, and the 3-player gameplay is a blast. It's definitely the star here and almost worth owning the disc all by itself. The third and final game is Gunsmoke, which is sort of the spiritual granddaddy of Konami's Sunset Riders games. It's presented in top-down, vertically scrolling fashion, but has you going after wanted criminals. The gameplay here takes some getting used to. The 3-button interface has A shooting to the left, B up the middle, and C shooting to the right. The fast, auto-scrolling levels add an intensity that forces you to always keep moving, and there are power-ups to increase your life, the effectiveness of your bullets, and increase your movement speed. This compilation isn't going to displace the better shoot-em-ups on the Saturn, but it's a fun throwback that still has just enough to keep your attention for a while. For those interested, it does have tate options should you need them. Capcom wasn't done with the interactive movie genre, and released a game based on the Japanese TV show 7-Star Fighting God Guyferd in November of 1998. This one wasn't as cut and dry as the others, however. This actually has 3D segments that allow you full movement to explore at will. You'll need to search things to find clues, like codes to bypass doors. Of course, that does lead to full motion video scenes where you need to follow along and press the button to see the next segment. It was the last of Capcom's full motion video titles for the Saturn, and the only one not based on a property they created themselves. For what it's worth, it has an Ultraman vibe to it, and the video quality is actually quite good. It supports the shuttle mouse if you have one, and was only released in Japan. The fifth and final Capcom Generation title was released in December of 1998 and contains 3 of the best fighting games ever made. Street Fighter II, Street Fighter II Champion Edition, and Street Fighter II Turbo Hyper Fighting would all be available here, very close to their arcade source material. The ports are extremely solid in regards to their faithfulness in animation, sprite size, and color. Once again, you do get some variance from the source material in regards to resolution, but nothing here most of you will care about. The overall package is actually quite nice, and I have dropped many an hour into reliving my arcade experience. This marked the last of the Capcom Generation releases in Japan. Capcom would not bring any of these games to the US for the Saturn, but Virgin Interactive did round up the first 4 in the series and release them in one package in Europe for the Sony PlayStation. The 5th disc here was released in the West as Street Fighter Collection 2 for the PlayStation, with the Saturn getting shafted yet again with no release at all. The series has its ups and downs, and I honestly believe many of them are worth owning on the Saturn even with their resolution and aspect ratio differences. If you are that much of a purist, you want nothing less than the arcade versions either way.
Perfect.
In March of 1999, Capcom delivered Saturn owners one of its best software packages, the unbelievable Dungeons & Dragons collection. It contains both of Capcom's D&D-based beat-em-ups from the arcade. The first is Tower of Doom, which was actually originally planned to be released in 1996 as a standalone product. It does not use the 4MB extended RAM cartridge, but still manages to be a strong port with excellent animation and color throughout. Choose one of 4 classes and go to work on the many enemies you'll face. There are multiple paths to take, many items to collect and use, and it all can be done in 2-player co-op. The second game is the more refined and impressive of the available offerings. Shadow over Mystara uses the 4MB extended RAM cartridge to bring us as close to the arcade as possible. More characters, more animation, more details, and more of what made the first game so much fun. You get more classes to choose from too, sending replay value through the roof. If you have a friend to join you, this can be one of the most enjoyable experiences on the platform, and one you can replay many times. It's challenging too, and not something you are likely to beat after a couple of tries. If all that sounds perfect, that's because it's pretty close, but I'd be lying to you if I said it was. Load times are frequent and long, even with the RAM cart, and do become tiresome after extended gameplay sessions. You also lose the 4-player co-op of the arcade version, down to 2 for both games in this collection. Newer versions of these games fix that, so you can have these experiences elsewhere cheaper and better playing. For a 5th generation title, however, it's a blast and one Saturn owners were lucky to get. In August of 1999, Capcom saw fit to deliver Street Fighter 03 to Saturn owners. It requires the 4MB extended RAM cartridge and is nothing short of a beast product. Part 3 here greatly expands the roster to include many more fighters, basically everyone from the previous Zero games, as well as some new faces as well. You get a complete overhaul in terms of gameplay systems too, now incorporating the Z-ism, the X-ism, and the V-ism. The Z-ism is traditional Zero playstyle of 3 levels of super combo gauge, zero counters, and air blocking, whereas X-ism is more of a Super Street Fighter II Turbo variety, or 1 large super combo gauge, no air blocking, and no Z counter moves. V-ism follows the Street Fighter 02 custom combo formula closely, which basically allows you to link just about any series of moves together in one long chain combo. There is enough variance and upgrades here over the previous games in this series to keep any fan happy, and it's all tied together by an incredible presentation. Graphics and sound are nothing short of impressive here, putting up one hell of an argument that the Saturn truly was a beast of a 2D machine. Glorious 2D animation plays out in every scene, and holds up better than any 3D polygon engine released during the same era. It was a showpiece title that gave Saturn owners one last hurrah before the system faded away with new, more powerful hardware on the market. This was actually released after the Dreamcast version in Japan, yet I still prefer the Saturn edition for numerous reasons. First is the Saturn's controller, which just absolutely shat all over the Dreamcast pad for 2D fighting games. The second was the Saturn's dramatic battle options, which included Reverse Dramatic Battle, one of the more fun and challenging Street Fighter modes ever made. It's a game I still play often and remains high on my list of greatest fighting games ever. Capcom's final Saturn game would be released in March of 2000, and be the only 3D polygon fighting game to use the 4MB extended RAM cartridge. It was developed by Capcom USA originally as an STV Titan arcade game, which was then ported to the Saturn in Japan. It uses characters from the Final Fight universe of games, and plays a tad bit like the Street Fighter EX titles that were released on the PlayStation. This one gets a lot of flack for being a poor game, and I admit that for a Capcom fighting game, it does rank pretty low on the totem pole. Compared to other 3D fighters, however, I don't really find it all that terrible. It is a bit silly, and the gameplay can be quite tiresome after a while, but it does have an interesting and diverse set of characters, each with different super moves and combos to learn. It doesn't threaten the likes of Virtua Fighter 2 on the Saturn, but it is unique in its own way. I certainly do not recommend that you run out and pay the crazy money this costs today, but I do advise at least trying it and making up your own mind. This has never been ported or released on anything else.
Guy wins!
Capcom was also involved in bringing the Saturn snowboarding game Steep Slope Sliders out to the STV Titan arcade platform. In a twist, the Saturn game was released first in Japan in October of 1997. Capcom would then join Cave and Pac-Insoft to convert the game into an arcade version for the Titan, releasing it the following year. It was an odd flow of events because normally it was the Saturn that would receive STV Titan ports, not the other way around. It's not a bad game if you have interest in the genre. The home version was released in every major territory. In 1991, Capcom released an arcade game called Three Wonders, a compilation of software spanning 3 different genres. The first was Roosters, a 2-player run-and-gun shooter that looked and sounded like something you'd see on a Neo Geo. The second was Chariot, a horizontally scrolling shoot-'em-up that looked similar to Roosters in art style and used an upgrade system similar to a few of Konami's games. The last was Danboru, a puzzle game similar to Capcom's pirate ship Hajimaru. While Capcom did not release this game on the Saturn themselves, it was licensed by Xing, who released their version of it under the Arcade Gears line in March of 1998. It stayed in Japan, of course, but was not a bad port of the arcade original at all. In fact, I quite enjoy Roosters for its co-op and challenge-filled gameplay. This wraps up my Capcom and the Sega Saturn series. I have to say that it was quite nice receiving all of these games from Capcom during the Saturn's run in Japan. They were a big part of my love for the platform, and I can truthfully say that the Saturn would not have been the same experience without them. I had been a big fan of fighting games during the mid-1990s, and they brought me so much to play on this platform alone. And it wasn't just that these games were available, but the excellent quality of most of them as well. You can look this list of games over and find very little in the way of stinkers here. Even when Capcom farmed out a port like Resident Evil, it still ended up being a good game overall. The only lamentable feelings I have from the experience is that Capcom never released Resident Evil 2 or Aliens vs Predator for the Saturn. These 2 games were in development, but were never released. I can only imagine how great an Aliens vs Predator could have been in 1997 with the extended RAM cartridge, or how great it could have been to have the Saturn's last Capcom game be a 4MB RAM cart special edition of Resident Evil 2. Those regrets aside, Capcom's run with the Saturn was nothing short of spectacular, and will always be some of my favorite memories of the time. Most hold up well even now, and look worlds better than the early Polygon games that would dominate the landscape outside of Japan. Quite frankly, they played a lot better too. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.